there are so many Generation Zers who are becoming millionaires just through drop shipping and starting their own businesses. Do we even need to have post-secondary education? Like literally, do we need colleges anymore? So we talk a lot in this episode with a professor named Dean, who's a very dear friend of mine, about education and what he's seeing in Gen Z. One of the things that he talks about is just what I did not know, how the education system has since become a heavy marketing machine for dollars, and why he feels that it's okay to have the government pay off the debt of some people who have really been taken advantage of by the education system. If we take education out of the federal hands and put it into state and city hands, what is that going to look like from curriculums? Are we going to create a situation where we're more segmented than ever? So I'd like to hear your thoughts. Definitely put in comments. I'd like to know what you have to think and what you have to say on my interview with Dean. He's an amazing person. And I think you'd be interested what he said was the most important thing that he thinks we should be teaching our kids right now. So why don't we just start with telling us a little bit about yourself? So people know like what I know. And I know once they find out all the experience you have, they're just going to be elated and they can't wait to listen to what you have to share.
All right. Yeah, that's a big setup. So I have a long history in corporate marketing and communications. And then I moved into higher education on the staff side as a marketing director for several years. But I sort of had a goal to teach. And so about 5 years ago, after returning to school and then graduating with my graduate degree in communication, I started teaching as an adjunct at Phoenix College. And then I took on a full-time faculty instructor role at Arizona State University. And I also adjunct at Southern Oregon University.
Oh, wow. So tell me a little bit about your curriculum. And I'm a communications person as well. As you know, I own a communications firm. But tell me a little bit about what made you make the transition and why you were so passionate about teaching people. Because it's funny, I feel the same way. I think that is my next evolution when I start to retire. I would really love to teach. And I didn't know that maybe it's just a communications thing where people share that kind of energy, when they just want to teach. But what brought that on?
There was a couple things. What you sort of summarized, I just had this urge, to do it. I felt like I was a marketing communications person for so long. And I was always surprised that the basics of communication are mostly not taught. And there's so many pitfalls and there was so much opportunity and excitement to teach. And so that's, kind of another reason that I sort of got into it and started teaching.
So how do you think like the basics of communications informs just everything as we start to mature, we get older, we engage in the workplace? Like what do you feel like is missing? Because that's a pretty dynamic statement. I too see it because as managing like 100 team members, I see it a lot with, I think more so Gen Z and millennials, more so, well, not millennials now because they've kind of aged out and had some more, on-site management experience in the workplace, but definitely with Gen Zs. What have you been seeing?
So aside from Gen Z, which I'll touch on in a moment, the thing that I see that's missing is just our process. If somebody's been at an organization, we eventually reward them with a management title and a role and responsibilities that come with it. But we don't teach them how to manage people. We don't teach them, how to communicate. So that's just a systemic problem that I think we've always had. We've never really taken that time to make it a staple in teaching. As far as Gen Z, I sort of have an opposite view of a lot of what I read, right? So I love to hear about it. I'm face to face with them. Often hundreds of them. And then I do have some online classes where I adjunct. So, it's asynchronous, but I do engage with, quite a few. And for the most part, they impress me. And so I think part of the struggle and part of the butting of heads that we see is that things have changed more rapidly in the last, say, 20 years than really in the history of humanity, especially if you just narrow it down to communication. So Gen Z grew up with a barrage of data. I remember, you remember if you and I were interested in like, hey, who was that actor? We didn't have anywhere to go, right? We had to ask each other. They have information at their fingertips, even if they're not actively going after something. Passively, they're just bombarded with stuff. So it's a different dynamic, for them. And then in our parents' generation, one household income was plenty to buy a house and live a comfortable life. And so they see that as, really not readily available for them, mixed with the fact that their communication style is so vastly different because of, the technology and the tools that they grew up with from birth. And so I see a butting of heads there from older school. Hey, this is how we did it, to Gen Z, which I had mentioned that I sort of have, some pride in them because they push back, right? They want a work-life balance and they push back on it. And I appreciate seeing that.
So question about that. Okay. So two things with that. So are you saying you think it's more so that we have, I don't want to say anyone in particular has an issue, but that it's not necessarily a them issue. It's more so a older millennial, Gen Z, baby boomer issue that needs to fully understand their perspective and where they're coming from. And so not necessarily just to say they won't listen, they won't get in line, but more so like we need to listen and we need to get in line.
I tend to view it from that perspective. Yes, I lean in that direction.
Okay. That is a very different perspective that I know a lot of people who are colleagues and peers would kind of see it as. And I think that perspective is playing out in the political landscape now. You know what I'm saying? I think it's playing out now because when you look at, this, we don't pick sides. Like that's the one thing about this podcast. We just deal straight with what we're seeing. We don't pick sides because I feel like that's a distraction. And we talk about that. We talked about that before. But when you really start to look at who's winning elections, and it's really the Gen Zs who are really going to decide the course of the country, regardless of the fact that I think baby boomers, older millennials, because I do classify older millennials who are kind of on the tail end of Gen X, what that looks like in a political landscape, I think we're starting to see that. The problem is, I know not necessarily with the Republicans, but with the Democrats, that is a real issue. And I'm not so sure that issue is as easily resolved because you do have this mindset with baby boomers, Gen Zs, versus Gen Zs that is completely opposite. So how does that play out in the political landscape? And what does that look like when we talk about removing federal oversight? Because it's a lot to unpack.
Yeah. So I'll start where, from what I see. So under the current administration, there's sort of a powerful narrative that education should be sent back to the states, right? Okay. So to connect that directly to Gen Z and Gen X and baby boomers butting heads is we need to be able to teach the Gen Z, the younger generation, how to communicate and be adaptable to the older generation, but we also need to teach Gen Xers and baby boomers, the same thing in reverse. However, if we're going to say, you know what, let's send everything back to the states, right? There's some benefit that say, hey, you know what, a local community knows how to speak to a local community. And so there's some benefit, to that. However, there's a lot of risk to that because then we become so incredibly segmented and education goes in wildly different directions that we're not like sort of speaking the same language. There's no set of standards. One of the examples I think you and I touched on when we spoke last week was that in Arizona, the legislator wanted to withhold 100% of state funds to the state schools, Arizona State University, Northern Arizona University, and University of Arizona, if they didn't stop teaching a list of stuff. And in there was implicit bias, cognitive bias, and unconscious bias.
Okay, now you got to break that down. What are the three types of bias?
Yeah. And so let's put them together for simplicity. If we don't teach bias, right, and then we can't teach why you're butting heads with, baby boomers and you're butting heads with Gen Z, because we have these implicit biases. One, bias is, we've always done it that way, right? That's a bias. That's people tend to lean towards that, right? Have you ever seen those Facebook posts where it's like, well, I used to drink from the garden hose when I was a kid, so it's safe, right? If the science says it's not safe, it's not safe, right? Just simply because you used to do it that way does not make it right. That is a bias that we all have, and they're not a bad thing. We all have, hundreds of different biases. Very true. We just need to recognize them. Not say yours is wrong and mine is right. We need to recognize them and figure out how to address them, how to employ communication skills in the situations. And so to bring it all back, I have some concern that if the federal government cuts all this funding to state, to universities and colleges, and then it mostly back to the local level, then it's sort of like a wild west of who's going to be taught what, and is something like Arizona. By the way, the governor vetoed that bill, so it did not pass. But is that sort of mentality and sentiment going to pass, peppered around the country in different states?
So if that were to happen, so let's talk about some of the courses that that they have dismantled. I think you said the critical thinking course was one of the ones as well they were trying to get rid of.
Yeah, anything that taught any of the biases in critical thinking goes right in there. I mean, it's about bias. We in all my classes, I'll go over some critical thinking fallacies and false arguments pretty much before we start, because I teach persuasion, consumerism, and business communication. And so there's arguments, there's debates. And so I try and set the stage like, hey, we want to be able to be critical thinkers. And so I highlight some fallacies. Those would be eliminated from being able to be taught.
So just a random question. What has the challenge been with getting the critical race theory topic through? I would admit, like, that's been a hot button, but I'm not so sure from what I'm hearing, like, people really understand, like, what that is and how that plays out. Do you know anything about that?
What I can tell you, what I know about it is from the absence of that ever being a thing that's ever come up. It was a manufactured issue. So in my experience with 3 institutions, it's not like anybody agreed or disagreed with it. It just didn't come up. And then all of a sudden it became a hot point in the culture war where everybody's talking about it, where they're putting people like me and I'm forcing it down everybody's throats. And I'm like, this is the first I've heard of it.
Well, that's so interesting, because I've heard that too from other people, that they never came across their desk. So I guess that is, like you said, one of those woke or cultural boogeymans, as I always say, that never really happened.
Yeah, it was a boogeyman issue to scare people. And it just, like you said, it didn't come across our desks.
What do you think would be the biggest concern after, like, if the federal government was able, because it seems like that's going to happen, that the education is going to be pushed to the states. What do you think that's going to look like? I know you typically deal in the college space, but what could that possibly look like, not just at your level, but at the other levels as well in education?
I think it is going to have ramifications well outside of higher ed, because what are we doing? We're educating our students so they can go into the workforce. And if we don't educate them on critical thinking, on bias, if we don't educate them, they're not going to be that effective. And I know that when we say words like bias and critical thinking and the evil word of diversity, it immediately sets people it sets them in two camps, right? Did you just say diversity? Right. But the thing is, it's imperative. It's essential. It's an elemental piece of like physics. Physicists, they have to learn observational bias when they're doing, experiments or whatever. There's going to be certain biases, that they're going to need to learn. So the results of their studies don't have bias, right? There's confirmation bias, right? They really, their theory is this, and they really want it to be that. They have to realize that confirmation bias, they're going to look into things a little bit differently, and they're going to tend to see it from the lens of what they want to see, right? So these are biases in hard sciences that we have to teach. But then we have greater biases that are more in communication and psychology for people to be able to be a good manager. You have to be able to see certain biases that you have. And I mentioned the word diversity because we immediately think of DEI related stuff, but diversity in a variety of contexts is really important to learn and adopt. If you have a group of 10 software engineers and they're going to make an app for some kind of niche, say mountain biking, right? That's my thing. Well, you know what? You probably need a couple mountain bikers. You probably need a couple designers for the app in there. You have 10 engineers. It's just not going to be user-friendly. It's not going to really speak to the audience. You need a diversity of opinions. And so when I speak of the importance of diversity, I have to stop. I have to step back, and I have to give examples on how it's not just the culture war, as you put it, boogeyman, that people think. And I tend to share this story, which I like, and I feel like it removes the fact that that diversity is greater than just what the current label is. And in the 50s, in 1954, I think, the Air Force found out they were having a lot of crashes and near misses in their, and they blamed it on the cockpit design. So what they did is they went and they took the measurements, 150 measurements of 4,000 plus pilots, and they measured their forearm length and their arm length and their inseam in their leg, and they built the cockpit to match the perfect average fighter pilot. And it didn't work. It got worse because it turned out when they looked at I think it was 4,003 people, nobody was average. It was such a diverse set of body styles that they couldn't build it for average. It was actually detrimental, and crashes and near misses increased. So then, like, you know what? We need to build the cockpit for extremes. We need to build the cockpit so it encompasses a diverse set of body types. And that's how I tend to go and introduce it, so I can say, hey, this is greater than what you're thinking, because diversity has been the name has been hijacked.
But why has it been hijacked? We did a preliminary interview last week for a gentleman, and his topic for the podcast was on if the economy is doing so bad. One of the podcast topics we came up with, and he made it a point to circle the conversation back to DEI and George Floyd. And I was thinking to myself, I was like, what? Why are we even talking about this? Like, but he made it a point he wanted to get the point across to me for whatever reason about diversity and DEI and inclusion. And I'm like, we're not even talking about that. But what I do think is, I personally think that the reason why diversity is so important is because most people who make the hiring decisions don't necessarily always look alike, right? Like everyone else in America. And we need to ensure that there's equity and access. But I also think there are some areas in the DEI, in several DEI initiatives that need to be reviewed and looked at. But I don't think you throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? I was able to have a very robust and blessed career in government contracting because I was able to get in on the 8A program. Well, from that program, I hired and trained like over 100 employees. And many of them were of various ethnicities, racial groups, men, women, orientations. And they have gone on to do very well. And I gave them career opportunities, regardless of whether they were white or black, and they have gone to work and still work at some of the major agencies. That is an example of the access for me paved the way for other people who didn't necessarily look like me. And I think that's the frustration that I have when people try to assault the DEI and diversity and inclusion. But I'm interested because I think it's just, it doesn't make sense, right? Because just because you give one person access does not mean that they're not going to give everyone else access. So just from that one opportunity for me, I've given over 100 other people opportunities through subcontracting, through training, through experience in the workplace where they didn't have the experience on their resume. I was able to hire those people and give them opportunities, right? But if I had never gotten that opportunity, more than likely, they wouldn't have never gotten that opportunity. Yep. So I think it's very much a pay it forward. There are areas that I think we as a country have moved beyond when it comes to DEI, but I think that needs to be investigated through a bipartisan organization, but not necessarily what we're seeing now, which is the assault on DEI. And what I really take offense to is DEI has become a code word for Black. And that I have a problem with because I am highly qualified and capable, but I think that sometimes people don't necessarily see that because they just immediately lump you all in. So I like to know a little bit about what are you seeing from and hearing from your Gen Z students about DEI and what's happening. Are they more woke where this is an issue, or are they don't see it as an issue anymore? Because I'm curious because a lot of them have moved beyond some of the things that were challenges for Gen X and baby boomers, especially when it comes to DEI and opportunity and access.
So unfortunately, it's still an issue. Like I mentioned,
really?
Mentioned the word DEI. So I can tell you roughly, because I try and keep tabs on this, there's probably about 20% of my students on a regular basis who have an immediate knee action that DEI is bad. And we discuss quite a bit.
Really? An immediate reaction
and
that DEI is bad.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. What happens is take, for example, public speaking. In public speaking, we have, I teach how to do different kinds of speeches. One is a persuasive speech. And so I say, pick an item, a topic, pick something that might be controversial. And you want to be able to not just argue it, but you want to persuade. That's your goal, to persuade the other people that don't agree. And so during that, I can tell about 80% pick something that would be more woke friendly, and about 20% pick something that is anti that. So I do see that pretty clean break on a regular basis. And I talk to them, and it mostly comes down to their family and their news source. That's what's determining their belief.
The family and news source. And see, that goes to what I was saying before, not fully understanding or having access to other people who don't look like you.
I agree. So
that's the problem. Like we wouldn't even need DEI.
I think I agree. I think one of the biggest strengths of DEI is that, it forces us to say, you know what? I don't know, right? I need to be aware of things. I'm never going to know everything, right? I teach some intercultural communication, and I don't know everything about every culture, not even a fraction of 1%. But my strength there, my education is I know I don't know. And so I have to be aware of that. And so DEI lets us know that because, we talk about bias. So what happens is when a hiring manager hires 50 people, they tend to look and talk and have a similar background to them. And so with DEI forces and says, hey, you know what? Just step back and look and say, this isn't the average pilot, right? That you're designing for. It's going to be a more diverse, set of pilots, and that's not a bad thing. So expand your view. So I think that's the real strength of DEI, is to make us question our awareness.
And I think that's a good perspective as well, because that's my foundational argument is show me who's at your wedding and show me who's at your baby shower.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have any diversity, then show me who's in your workplace, right? because I think for me, even being a mom and raising my daughter, I'm very intentional to ensure I curate her social circle, even as young as she is now, to ensure that she has diversity of friends, because I personally believe that perspective is important. Because when she enters the workplace, then she's able to interact and network and know as many people as possible. And as a matter of fact, I was at church a few months about last year, and I met this Caucasian couple, this white couple, and they were so cool, and we just hit it off. And I was like, what about the community? I have since moved to the community. I said, what about the community do you like? And they said, you know what? We grew up, we lived in Georgia, and we were literally, there was no diversity at all. And I thought about it because they have 2 children. And I thought about it and I was like, this is not what the world is going to look like in 20 years. And to ensure that my children are successful, they need to know and be comfortable interacting with all people. And I was just so impressed by that. And I think that's what I share as well. My sense of personal belief as well is that shared understanding of people makes better people. But what I'm seeing is everyone doesn't feel that way. And to what extreme, going back to the topic at hand, education in the States, what does education look like in Texas, in Idaho, in Florida, if you don't have any kind of federal oversight? I think we're going to dig a deeper hole into segmentation, and what's really going on now is just going to be supersized.
I agree. So in order to welcome somebody where we respect them and we care more about them, we have to not treat them like an out group. And that's a natural human thing, our in group and our out group, right? We have all these, groups. Your family is an in group, another family is an out group, right? So it's easy to say that group is wrong. But the more time you spend and you get to know them, you build empathy. And then all of a sudden there's a connection and there's a trust. And that's how we grow. And that's how different people, mesh, and make a greater community. However, like you pointed out, what happens if, let's use Idaho as the boogeyman. I lived in Idaho for a while.
Oh, really? Is it the boogeyman?
So, it is way worse now because I still have very strong connections to it. But I was there for like 13 years. But now it's absolutely what you're saying is we don't want the outsiders. There's even California. Keep the Californians out. We don't want California.
Really?
Yeah. See somebody with California plate, they're ruining our state, right? That's how it is. So it's very segmented. So to your point, now if we take education and we remove any federal input and oversight, it's going to just dig a hole deeper and deeper where they're going to be more and more isolated.
And with that isolation, what is also concerning is indoctrination. So we're not necessarily focusing on the education and math, the technical aspect of education, but more programming. And that is what I'm concerned, because it really is Gen Zs in the society that we live in, with as much access to social media and digital as people have, that's 20% is still a large percentage of people who really have that kind of level of bias.
Yeah.
And that's the ones who are comfortable talking about it. So it's probably a lot more than that.
I think the thing that we need to be aware of is that social media and aggregate news feeds like Apple News and Google News, they reinforce the bias, because if you're sharing something and you're liking something and that's a very biased view, now Facebook, for example, or Instagram, TikTok, they're going to feed you more of that stuff that you've actually engaged with. So after a very, very short time, your feed is just the stuff. Now it's confirmation bias. It's just the stuff that you've already sort of dipped your toes into. And that's how you become deeper and deeper and deeper. So even though you had mentioned like it's a good thing, like they have access to all this data, the problem is most of the algorithms for, every single one. They just simply want to give you stuff that you're going to share, and interact with and leave a comment. So it's going to just make that deeper and deeper, and it becomes this echo chamber.
As it's like they don't have the emotional maturity as well to kind of censor through that and say, well, that's not all people.
Yeah, correct. I teach a consumerism and communication class, which is a critical look at consumerism. And in it, in the very, very, very first class, I always ask the students, are you an agent or a dupe? Meaning when you buy stuff, do you have agency? Do you make all your own decisions, or are you duped? And most students say they're an agent, maybe 90% of them, that they make their own decisions. By the end of the class, it just all the time, it's about 100%. They're like, I'm a dupe all the time.
Really?
Because they start realizing the power of messaging and how it's really taking some of their autonomy away. And they don't even realize it until we spend, 3 months highlighting it and pointing it out. And so it's awesome, and it's educational, and it's fun. However, I get to do that in that class, right? I don't get to do that in every class. So they're very much a victim, so to speak, of their news feed and their social media feed.
Well, I was going to say, I'm hoping that the small screen like podcasts can kind of help with that. But going back to what you're saying, that might be more detrimental, because then you're following people who kind of share your own belief system. And what I will do sometimes is I'll intentionally follow or listen to someone who, I kind of sit on both sides. I see both perspectives a lot of times. But what I can do is I can, like people that I'm completely polar opposite with, I sit and I listen just to force myself to maintain a sense of growth and maturity, to say, okay, I can kind of see that perspective. Because even though you don't agree, if you can see a person's perspective, I think that's the first step. How does that play out with your students? Like at the end, how do they recognize they're being duped? And is it just something that they say, okay, I'm being duped? Or do they walk away feeling like, okay, this is something I need to look at my whole life for? I know you're only a teacher for a little bit of time.
Yeah. But in that particular class, they do. And so I have, 3 papers that they have to write, throughout the semester, and they're all reflection based. And so they often, share these things, and they do come to terms with it. And so for them, they're open. And I think we started this by saying I'm kind of a fan and I'm impressed by Gen Z. They are very, for the most part, they're just open. It's like you tell them something that contradicts with their identity.
Yeah.
Right. If I do that to my Uncle Frank, I don't have an Uncle Frank, but you know what I mean? Like he would fight back immediately. But if you give them some criticism on their critical thinking skills, I get it. And they adapt.
I find that with my nieces as well. Like if I were to say to them, I will say, well, what about, because I think they're really excited about socialism. I personally am not a fan of socialism. I think that we're not prepared for that. When you talk about universal healthcare, I lived in London before, and I know that some people, it sounds great, but when you have to wait years to get surgery, if you don't have private healthcare, then I just know the nuances of that. And I think that when you look in the US, universal healthcare may sound great, but we are short. We worked on a project with National Health Service Corps. We're short 100,000 primary care physicians. So how is that going to work? And then AI is going to get rid of all these jobs, which is going to replace the tax base. How is that going to work, right? So I think it's just not, when I present that to her, and she's like, well, I don't know about that. I don't know about that. I don't know about that. That's for y'all older people to figure out, right? So they want the benefits, but they don't want that's my thing. It's like, show me who's going to pay for it. And don't tell me that 2% of the rich is going to pay for it. Like it can't that's a non-starter for a lot of people. So when you have those conversations with them about education in particular, what do you get into how moving education to the state is going to impact their life, their community, their future? Because I don't really think they understand that.
Just in that one particular class that we do, I have a module dedicated just higher education, and we touch on state versus federal, but there's sort of a deeper issue there where in the United States, we have officially designated students as consumers so they could be marketed to directly. And that's why the money stopped flowing to universities and started flowing directly to the states, then to universities, and the money stopped. So states started marketing more. And now if you look at advertising for universities, it's about this amazing dorm with pool tables and pools.
Hold on. You got to walk me back through that, Dean. So what happened? How did that come about?
In the 70s and 80s, we started changing how we designate a student or a potential student. And so now they are a consumer. They are labeled as a consumer, so they could be marketed to directly. So less money goes, the government provides less money to state institutions, which had a lot of freedom when they did that. They would get the money, they would be able to develop classes that they thought were important to know in the future. And now when it becomes, when the student is a consumer, now they like, you know what? I have to get this student to come here. So I'm going to talk about pool tables. I'm going to talk about these fancy dorm rooms, right? I'm going to talk about all these great amenities and the actual courses and education. Two things happens. One, they get pushed aside in the discussion. And then two, it's like, well, I can't really have this major because it's not producing somebody who can graduate and get a job doing that, right? And that sounds okay on paper, but what happens is then you're just narrowing it down and you're just making it so it's just like we need an accountant and we need a teacher, right? But there's a lot of things that we don't know where the world is going, and so we want to
especially with AI now, right?
Yes. Especially with AI. Now communication is actually becoming the main sought after skill from employers. They want people who have these soft skills because they're so lacking.
Wow. So what does that look like? So I believe in the arts. I believe in the the creative process, design, fine art, music. What is that going to look like? Because even with AI, we're going to lose all these white collar jobs. I still feel like there's an art to culinary skills. I feel like there's an art to being a fine artist, music, dance, like entertainment. I feel like that's still very valuable. And especially having a child, I know that kids learn through play. They also learn through art therapy as well. That's been very effective. So you're telling me that the government took the funding away from the schools. So now the schools have to mark. Now, that's not, of course, at the Ivy level though, right? That's mostly at like state institutions.
Well, some of the Ivy schools, they have so much money from endowments.
Right.
Right. So they have a lot more freedom.
Right. Which is what we're seeing play out with Harvard.
Yeah.
The pushback.
And so, but when you look at other schools that are, that don't quite have that freedom, they do need to market amenities. They need to be able to get you excited enough to come to, their particular school. It's more difficult now to say, hey, we have a really solid accounting degree, because they're looking at the students are used to being marketed to. And so they're looking at a great accounting degree or accounting degree, plus, they've got all these cool amenities, right? And so that's what a lot of the money is being, spent on universities around the country for a couple decades now.
Oh, really? And so on average, how much money does, I know you may not know this because you're not in administration, but are we talking like millions of dollars or like at a university level that might be a state university, a well-known state university?
Yes, it is millions. And I don't have the number in front of me, but I do have the numbers when we do it in class. I just can't remember off the top of the head. But there are some schools that spend in the 20% of their money on marketing. And so that could be money spent on classes, on education.
Right.
And, and we're forced to, do it on marketing. And to take it back to states versus federal, what happens is you might have a state that says, you know what, I don't, this art therapy, no, get rid of it, right? Music therapy, we just need teachers and accountants. We need to populate the empty jobs that we have out there. And there's nothing on the circumference of the core jobs. And so then we lose out on that because we have the greater diversity of knowledge that's being lost.
Yeah. And what happens, like, when you look at just from an education perspective, what's going on with the curriculum? How is the curriculum decided at a university level? Like, who decides what goes in the curriculum, what students are going to be learning?
So the departments at like the communication department at every school, they'll design a course, right? They'll do it with the input of us. And we might design it wholly. The department, the chair, they'll look at it, make any changes, and then it has to get approved from the university level on the course, and so of the course. And so then you have some risks if the federal government now is dangling and saying, "Hey, I only want you to teach this and this and this," right? They then might subconsciously say, "Well, I don't want to approve these 7 courses because they're too fluffy." Right. And I don't want the government cutting money. So I'm going to just focus on these, core elemental classes that's not going to ruffle any feathers. So
but it's not going to be game changing as far as critical theory.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. And so with that being the case, then you don't have to answer this if you're not comfortable with it. But when you're looking at people learning with Udemy, online courses, training schools, and YouTube, and making a decent salary. Like, I was watching this guy the other day, and I think AC Hampton, and he's making millions of dollars a year. I don't know if he's college educated or not, but he's making millions of dollars a year, and he does drop shipping. And so you have a lot of Gen Z. What's going to happen to education? Because what's my incentive to want to go to college if I could still travel the world, do digital content? Like, why am I going to go and get an accounting degree? I'm much more happier doing this, and I can make a good living.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if somebody can, more power to them. But I think what happens is that's a little bit of an availability heuristic where we only see the very, very few people that are successful. Like, we tend to think of dropping out of an Ivy League school and starting a tech company is a real viable thing because, Mark Zuckerberg and Steve Jobs and Bill Gates all dropped out and are gazillionaires. However, we don't see the 99.9999% that, never are going to make it to that. And so what happens is that's probably not the best way to go. I mean, if you have an opportunity, sure, go ahead and take it. But an education, it offers so much more. One, you're dedicating 4 years to a thing, and you are accomplishing that thing, right? That means a lot. You've learned how to manage time. You've learned how to show up. You learned how to write. You learned how to be criticized, right? So whatever the major is, there's right there is a benefit. And then the second thing is when you're going to be an astrophysicist, for example, you have to learn some communication skills. Right. So you're a better astrophysicist. You and I talked briefly. I think we're both fans of Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Yes, very much so.
He is a communicator. He's a master communicator. Right. I know some astrophysicists and they know their stuff, but when they communicate, they don't, they've never been trained in communication. And so what happens, there's this loss. Their knowledge and their passions are lost outside their circle because they don't communicate. Carl Sagan had said something, I'm going to butcher it, but he said something: when we send astronauts, to space or to the moon, we need to not just send scientists. We need to send a poet. Like, one of the group should be a poet. Otherwise, the scientists can't come back and express and illustrate and get you driven about space because they're looking at it through the mindset of an engineer or a particle physicist or whatever it may be, where the poet can speak to the masses and motivate us. And that kind of sums up, what I think.
I did a business delegation to Germany for a huge conference, I think Hannover Massey, a couple of years ago. And it was so interesting because I think it was BMW, one of the top auto brands. And they were saying how they were hiring people for their engineer and their tech team. I was like, oh, wow, the job sounded amazing. And I was like, oh, well, I said, too bad I don't have an engineering degree. And they were like, what? They were like, no, we hire people who are artists to work on. I couldn't believe it. Going to your point, because they want to have, again, the diversity of thought, input. And I was like, oh my God. So it's just interesting that when we, like you said, like we started, when you talk about education, diversity, it's also then the skill set and the ideas, the fact that they leverage that to how does the car look? How does it feel when you sit in it? What's the aesthetic of the car? Like just different things that most people would just think there would be a bunch of boring engineers, but then you have like the creative director, this artsy person that comes in and is working on an auto design team. I'm like, what? But those are the kind of things that I think, is often missed and people don't really discuss when we have conversations about diversity. So just as we enter our last 20 minutes, I wanted to ask you, what things do you think Democrats have done well with education and their area of improvement? And what things do you think Republicans have done well and some of the areas of improvement?
So I'll start with what the Republicans have done well is communicated. I don't agree with creating these boogeymen such as, DEI, but that's what they've done. They have taken something and they've communicated it to get their people or people on the outskirts that may come into their camp. They get them to act. I don't think the Democrats have done that very well. I think the Democrats have tried to just put it out there, hoping that you come along and you adopt it. When you had mentioned BMW and they hire designers and that sort of thing instead of just the engineers, it reminds me of something I tell students all the time: emotion compels action. So what happens is if we focus constantly on facts, right? That's great. There's some people like me, like very logical. I love facts, but emotion is what compels actions. The Democrats have not done as good a job as the Republicans. The Republicans are fostering these emotions. A lot of it, unfortunately, is the culture wars to get people to act, but it works. It gets people invested and engaged. And I think, you and I touched on it a little bit. There's a principle, a human nature, where once we publicly acknowledge something, we tend to stick to it.
Yes.
And so the Republicans have done a really good job of getting people to stand up and say, this is what I believe. And once you do that publicly, it's harder to backtrack from it. And so they have, it's called commitment and consistency. So they've built that. And so a lot of their followers, the people under their umbrella, are a bit more committed and vocal, and they're okay about sharing it and speaking about it. So I think that's what they've done right and what the Democrats have done wrong.
But I think Trump also has given them permission to do that, right? So he's not PC. I think one of the first things that went wrong is when people stopped saying what they really thought. It's like, oh, I got to hold back. I can't say that. And I think you could say anything with respect. I've always felt like that. But when you're dealing with people who have very little emotional intelligence, they don't know how to communicate to say, I don't really think I don't really support that, but I hear your point and your perspective. And to say it in a way that someone's like, well, why don't you agree with that? Well, this is why. Okay. Well, like the practical barbecue conversation that people can have and not leave and be upset is all in the delivery. You and I are communications people, so we know that. But the culture wars, I think, I'm disheartened to say, I think that's going to continue to go on. But I think if you have places and spaces, and I read a lot of content and comments from usually on YouTube, mostly because it's, you have the videos, the content, the topic of the content. But when I look at the comments, people are really down the middle. Like you have very few people who are like what I call the crazies, but for the most part, people are down the middle. And I think, and people are reasonable and people are practical, but there's really no voice for them. And I think if we had a space even on network and broadcast, you don't really see it. If we had I used to thought it was CNN. I don't think that anymore, where you have a space where people could say, well, I don't necessarily agree with that, but I hear your point. I think that would open everyone else up to kind of be reasonable.
I agree. And we don't have that space. And, remember, I don't even know, 30 years ago when we really started, like CNN, I had Crossfire. We decided, you know what? We're going to have two sides.
Right.
This side and this side. And you guys, and all of a sudden, well, that's how the country went.
Correct. Like, that's true.
It doesn't have to be binary, right?
Correct.
I can agree with you, but then I could disagree on another thing. And
right.
we created it where, no. You're there or you're there, everything, all or nothing. And so
what have the Democrats done right?
What was that?
What have the Democrats done right with education?
At this point, it's just they're fighting to not stop the funding. So they see the big picture. I just don't have much confidence in their ability to communicate and motivate people to act. But I agree with their picture more so. They just failing to communicate.
So if you were president and you could do anything like President Trump, how would you organize education from a federal, state, and local perspective?
That's
I know I'm hitting what you won't want to think about.
Yeah, I would, lean towards a federal oversight. And I would also look at how we could reverse students being consumers, because I think that was a big downfall for the United States versus other countries. I think money should go to schools. Schools should decide what kind of majors that they what kind of majors they should, create for their school and the courses, and not be held to say, hey, we have accounting openings, we have teacher openings. You need to just fill those buckets. Otherwise, you're useless to society. I think they need to expand and create these things that are maybe out there on the fringe and they become mainstream, or maybe they fizzle out. But we need to explore those, and we need to expand our knowledge greater than just, the core courses that we would, plug in on that match careers.
How about free education for community college? What do you think about that?
I'm oversimplifying, but we have free education for grade 9, 10, 11, 12. I think we could do it for grade 13, 14, 15.
You're saying all the way, or just for community college, like the foundational?
I would like to see it, all the way, or at least a completely different system. As somebody who works in higher education and somebody who has kids currently going to college, it's a cluster. It's confusing, right? You're getting a Pell Grant, you're getting a subsidized loan here, you're getting a non-subsidized loan there. This one you start paying back 6 months after you graduate. This one you start paying back immediately. This one you don't pay except for interest until a certain date. And students are just burdened with debt. I think that is the thing that I would fix and streamline. Many other countries in like Europe and stuff, even if it's not free education, you get one loan that's a low interest rate loan. You don't start paying back till you graduate, and it covers everything.
And I think under this new legislation, your parents cannot get a loan for you. I'm going to check into that. I don't think your parents can get a loan for you, your student loan. And I think that you have to apply to get a loan like you would any other loan, like a consumer loan. And that is going to be devastating for a lot of people. I think if we can make at least the first year or two free for community college, that would enable people to get a foundational job like an accounting specialist, or they can get a tech job, something like run a lot of the apprenticeship programs through community colleges and have that be free. And then I think you should pay for maybe junior and senior year. I personally am not a fan of reimbursing and paying for people's student loans. I've had very heated conversations with my friends on that because, I'm like, that was one of the things I did not agree with Biden on. Like, no,
So
you should.
I look at that from the perspective of for-profit schools, and they have been so predatory.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay,
we have thousands of students that were lied to, and and it's like, you know what, 87% of our graduates get a job in this field, and it turns out that wasn't true.
Oh, see, this is a good example. I did not consider that. Okay,
yeah,
wow.
And so they went into debt. And I cover this in the consumerism class in the higher education module. And I have these stories of these women that went to, was it nursing or dental hygienist, something along that. And they went in debt, $30, $40, $50,000. And they were never able to get a job because they lied about their certification, right? The school lied about the certification, or the school was certified, but no states accepted the certification. And so there was so much that these poor students now have the same job they had before they went into debt. Now they have $50,000 in debt, which becomes $60,000, which becomes $70,000. And, a couple of them are 20 years later and they're still paying off their student debt. So that's that
federal oversight. That's where federal oversight is needed. Definitely. Okay. Oh, that's good. Yep. I didn't even think about that. Okay. Any final thoughts for us as we wrap up? This has been so great. I learned so much, and I know all the listeners will as well. Any thoughts? Any final words you want to share?
Yeah. You had brought up AI several times. And so I'm a proponent of AI. I think it's going to take over jobs, but I also think it's going to create jobs. But the big concern I have with it is related to the biases that we talked about. AI has a unique trait. It's so damn confident, right? When AI gives you an answer, it's so confident. However, it's mirroring our biases, like completely. If you ever go to GPT and say, hey, create me an image of a table full of analog watches, right? The old school watches. It's going to go ahead and it's going to create a really cool image, but every single watch is going to have the hand on the 10 o'clock and the 2 o'clock, every one. And that's because the entirety of human history of marketing watches, it's visually appealing to have the 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock. And so in its database, that's what it displays. And so all this table of watches, they're all at the 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock location. And then even when you tell AI, hey, now create me a table of watches, but make it 12:03, it comes back and it gives you 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock. It can't get out of its own way. And so that's a visual slap in the face. But when students use it for something and they're getting a biased answer on some ideology or something else, they might not even know, right? The watch, they'll know. That's not 12:03. They know that. But these other things, it's not visually slapping you in the face that it's incorrect.
But wouldn't that be a foundation of critical thinking to know that? But so let's start there real quick. What do you think is critical? How do you define critical thinking?
Being able to simplify, being able to when you speak your piece, before you do, say, what are the opposing arguments? And how can I address those, ethically and authentically, right? That would be the basis of critical thinking. So if you're going to do, because I have students do persuasive speech on gun control every single semester. I have somebody do, we don't need any gun control, and somebody will do some, or multiple people will do, we need more gun control. And they give me a rough draft. And then I look at it, I'm like, oh, this is good. This is interesting. I said, but there's some clear rebuttals that you're just ignoring. And I said, you need to address those rebuttals, but you need to do it in a way that doesn't create another obvious rebuttal. And I think that's the basis of critical thinking, is just go a couple layers deep. And you know what happens is when the students start doing that and they look at the obvious rebuttals and then the obvious rebuttals to whatever they're going to come up with, sometimes they change their opinion. They're like, oh, I didn't realize this.
I didn't know that. I didn't think that.
Yeah. And so that's, I think, the core, and that's how I'm going to distill it, is to be able to say, hey, what is somebody going to rebut, and how can I have an authentic and genuine response to that? And if I can't, then maybe my stance needs to be readjusted.
I feel sometimes, shouldn't that be parenting? Like, I get stuck on a lot of things, I think, in society with what I think parenting should be. And what I feel like too many things are put on teachers, infrastructure, schools. Like, shouldn't that be a parent's job to do those things? Like, to critically say to your kid, like, hey, yeah, but you had a spat with your best friend in sixth grade, right? What do you think? What's our perspective on what happened?
I would say if we had a baseline where throughout history we were experts at critical thinking, then I would say it's the parent's job. But it's not anything that we've really had a baseline on mastering critical thinking. And there is a lot of nuance to it. We've talked about biases and, heuristics and mental shortcuts, and there's hundreds of them. We make decisions like this, right? And a lot of times we have to realize why we made those decisions. And I think for a lot of parents, that's outside their expertise and their experience. And so to use an analogy of state controlled schooling and federal controlled schooling, it would be the same analogy. The states might have their own culture wars or biases, and that's what they're instilling. And the parents might not have that grander view. And so their kids are just coming out like a state would develop.
Huh. Okay. I love chatting with you, Dean. It's so good. Any parting thoughts? Like, what should I be focusing on with my daughter who's 3 and preparing her for this society we're in, considering what the education is shaping up to be?
Oh, she's 3?
I started late, Dean. I started late.
Okay. Well, yeah, my youngest is 12. And I would say, this is going to be off topic from everything we talked about. I would say
that's great.
The main thing that I want to instill in my kids is to be kind.
Okay.
And work on everything else, but just always be kind.
I think that's a good final place to stop.
Yeah. All right. Great.
Thank you so much, Dean. I really enjoyed chatting with you. Great points. And we'll see you on the other side. Bye.
All right. See ya.
So you've seen the interview, lots to talk about. We unpacked quite a bit of things in the time that we have. And I have to say, there are 2 things that I walked away from feeling more confident about. One, I need to figure out something. I need to figure out what's going to happen if we continue down this path. Am I going to be homeschooling? I can't homeschooling. Am I going to be doing a micro school scenario with my child? Am I going to be writing a bigger check for private school? What is that going to look like? How am I going to navigate planning her education as it relates to her future? Because I don't think anything is standardized now, and that's the problem. The second thing I walked away from is we need spaces where people aren't crazy and people can share insights and feedback about what they're seeing, not covered under the boogeyman of Democrats and Republicans, because I see issues on both sides. So definitely like to know your thoughts. Make sure you subscribe. Make sure you put in comments. And I love you guys. We got a lot of work to do, but let's start with a reasonable and smart discourse. All right. See you guys later. Love you. Bye.